Things you learn from Christian history. Number 8. If you encourage people to think for themselves, they will. The Reformation made following God a matter of individual conscience, based on the interpretation of Scripture. Its leaders then got really hot under the collar, and people started making their own decisions based on their own readings of Scripture. Tough. Chapter 8. Print, Protestants and Peasants. Johnny Gooseflesh. In 1454, the year after the fall of Constantinople, the world changed. Again. It was all down to a man called Johannes Gensfleisch, which literally means Johnny Gooseflesh. Understandably, he decided that he would rather be known as Johannes Gutenberg, and he invented a device called a printing press, where each letter was set in type, character by character. He launched his new invention with an edition of the Bible. Gutenberg's invention changed the world. It brought him fame, but not riches. Gutenberg was a great inventor, but a rubbish entrepreneur. The first edition of his Bible took him 2 years, comprised 150 copies, and nearly bankrupted him. It was left to others to make a commercial success of printing books, and printing spread rapidly in Italy, France, and Germany, aided by another major new technology, paper. I say new, although the earliest paper ever discovered was unearthed by archaeologists in a Tibetan desert town and dates to the late 3rd century AD. However, it took 1,000 years before the first paper mill in Europe was founded in Germany in the 13th century. As books became cheaper and smaller, knowledge and ideas could spread further and faster than ever before. Bibles began to flood from the presses. In the decades following Gutenberg, over 70,000 Bibles were printed in Central Europe, not to mention 100,000 New Testaments. They were printed in Latin, of course, but also in High German, Low German, Dutch, Catalan, Middle German, Portuguese, Polish, lower left-hand side German, Czech, French, Italian, Russian, and Ethiopian. But not in English, obviously. We wouldn't want to give people ideas now, would we? It wasn't just Bibles either. As we've seen, the collapse of Constantinople brought many refugee Greeks to Italy. They found work in the printing industry, first as scribes, then as translators preparing Greek texts for publication. But expertise wasn't the only thing these refugees brought with them. They brought new texts as well, the writings of the classical authors, poetry, drama, scientific treatises, theological works. In the West, for the first time in 1,000 years, people began to study Greek. They also studied Hebrew, although there were a couple of problems with that. A, it went backwards, and B, there was always a risk that you might catch Jewishness. Everyone knew reading Hebrew was risky. A monk in Freiburg said, "Those who speak this tongue are made Jews." Of course, not all Greeks travelled west. Some priests remained in Constantinople and the Turkish Empire, but it was Russia and the Slavic nations that were to become the new home of Orthodox worship. And they even adopted the old Roman title for their leader. He became the Caesar, or Tsar, as they termed it. And just for good measure, they called Russia the Third Rome. After 1,000 years, based in Constantinople, Rome had moved to Moscow. Vive la République! Politically, Europe was changing. Spain became the new superpower in Western Europe. It was determined to be both powerful and pure, so it expelled all the Muslims and Jews within its borders, at least all who would not convert to Christianity. England and France had already expelled all Jews 200 years previously. This zeal for purity so impressed the Pope, he gave the King and Queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, approval to purge their land of all heretics for good measure. They set about reforming the monasteries, rooting out corruption, educating the clergy, and their tool for doing this was the Inquisition. In Spain, the Inquisition acted with a chilling, ruthless efficiency. Managed by Thomas de Torquemada, it extracted confessions, rounded up suspects, and burnt at the stake not only heretics, but Christians of Jewish or Moorish descent who were suspected of backsliding. Around 2,000 people died in this reign of terror. Meanwhile, the papacy had finally realised that they were never going to be real kings, so they settled for living like kings instead. The popes of this time are notorious for having tons of money and virtually no morals. They built splendid new churches and sponsored magnificent works of art, but In order to fund these, taxation went as high as their church towers, and clerical posts were sold to the highest bidder. Perhaps the state of the papacy at this time is best illustrated by one of its most notorious members, Alexander VI, formerly known as Rodrigo Borgia. He bribed his way into the post in 1492. Though aged 61 at the time, he had a 19-year-old mistress, whose brother, Alessandro Farnese, the Pope made a cardinal. Indeed, all his relatives got plum jobs. The word nepotism comes from the habits of popes and bishops who would give places to their nephews. Sometimes these were genuine nephews, sometimes it was a euphemism for their illegitimate sons. Anyway, the Italian word for nephew is nepote, hence nepotism. Pope Alexander had first been made a cardinal because he was the nephew of Pope Calixtus III, head of the Borgia family. The practice was ended by Pope Innocent XII in 1692. Borgia was a patron of the arts, commissioning works from people like Michelangelo. He also commissioned murders from various assassins, and he staged sex shows in the Vatican. Both of these were probably staged by his cruel and rapacious nephew, Duke Cesare, who was also a cardinal. According to a report from the Venetian ambassador, every night 4 or 5 men are discovered assassinated, bishops, prelates, and others, so that all Rome trembles for fear of being murdered by the Duke. For the last few years of his life, he never appeared in public without a mask, because his face was so badly disfigured by syphilis. This disease was new. It had arrived with the French soldiers when they invaded Italy in 1494. The Italians called it the French pox, a name which, much to the irritation of the French, was quickly adopted throughout Europe. Alexander VI, then, was that rare thing in history, a pope with an STD. Should have used a condom. It didn't kill him, though. He died aged 72 when, allegedly, an attempt to poison one of his cardinals backfired. In the long catalogue of evil, rapacious, morally bankrupt popes, Alexander VI really stands out, which is saying something. In Florence, there was a Dominican friar called Girolamo Savonarola, a fiery preacher who cut out the middleman and claimed direct communion with God. He hated the wealthy aristocracy who ruled the Italian states at the time, especially the Medici in Florence, the Duke of Milan, and most of all, Pope Alexander VI. Popes and prelates speak against worldly pride and ambition, and are plunged in it up to their ears. They preach chastity and keep mistresses. They think only of the world and worldly things. For souls they care nothing. They have made of the church a house of ill fame, a prostitute who sits upon the throne of Solomon and signals to the passers-by. O prostituted church, you have unveiled your abuse before the eyes of the whole world, and your poisoned breath rises to the heavens. He prophesied a flood of biblical proportions, and the arrival of a new mighty warrior, like Cyrus in the Bible, and coming from the north. So, when the French army arrived in Florence, it seemed like his prophecy had come true. The French ousted the ruling house of Medici, who left to concentrate on their greetings card business, and left the city in the control of Savonarola. Savonarola's Florence was a Christian and religious republic, indeed the first truly modern republic, as in ruled by the whole people. The new constitution granted every citizen in good standing the right to a vote in a new parliament, the Great Council. It is a debt that is rarely acknowledged by modern republics, but the basic idea of modern democracy was invented by a rogue Catholic monk. However, there were limits to his newfound freedom. The city also enforced a strong moral code, banning same-sex relationships, adultery, public drunkenness, and young men, a sort of Savonarola youth, roamed the streets, telling people off if they were immodestly dressed. There were also regular bonfires of the vanities, during which citizens would come to chuck their mirrors, makeup, fancy clothing and paintings on the fires, along with worldly books, musical instruments, and even games such as chess. Tragically, the paintings burned included several by Michelangelo and Botticelli. It was Puritan England, only warmer and with more olive oil. The Pope ordered the arrest and execution of Savonarola. Savonarola was excommunicated, and when the brave new world he'd promised failed to arrive, the Florentine people lost faith in their fiery priest and handed him over, along with 2 associates. They were tortured, and on 23rd of May, 1497, the 3 were led out into the Piazza della Signoria in Rome, stripped of their friars' robes and hanged. For good measure, a fire was lit under them, so that Savonarola would burn just like all those vanities the Pope loved so much. But Savonarola cast a long shadow. Not literally, though. He was described as only being of middle height. His body was burned, but the words he wrote in prison spread around Europe, and he became a kind of symbol of all that the authorities, ecclesiastical and secular, were up against. Nearly 100 years after his death, the Grand Duke of Florence was still forbidding monks, friars, and nuns in the city even to mention his name. So, to sum up this bit, the reign of Pope Alexander VI saw the invention of several features of modern life, notably republicanism and syphilis. Oh, and colonialism, because in 1493 the Pope gave official approval to the dividing up of Africa and America.